So you were talking about the apartheid comparison, and that in fact Canada and North America, this kind of expansionist play.
Yeah, of course, the roots of the United States in kind of the Indian Wars, and the roots of the United States in a rejection of the principles of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 led the United States to become very aggressive and militaristic. One of the famous Indian fighters, oftentimes the Indian fighters in the United States became President of the United States, like William Henry Harrison, who was fighting Tecumseh. He became President of the United States. Andrew Jackson became President of the United States, and it said that General Custer, George Armstrong Custer, was campaigning to become President of the United States. So the keys to the White House often led through a defeat of Indian people. It was a way to become politically popular in the United States. Andrew Jackson, when he became president, one of his major policies was the Indian removal policy, to uproot Indian people, all Indian people east of the Mississippi, and force them to go west of the Mississippi to an Indian territory. Now that territory is the state of Oklahoma. Of course that took place. The Cherokee famously fought Indian removal in court. They took their case to the Supreme Court. They won in the Supreme Court, and Andrew Jackson's response was, well, let the Supreme Court enforce it. So the Trail of Tears marched Indigenous people out of territory east of the Mississippi, most famously the Cherokee, so we haven't had a displacement policy like that in Canada. Most Indigenous peoples are in their Aboriginal territories. They haven't been transplanted in the same way.
How would you say history has turned out for people today? I mean, if you bring it forward to more future, present tense.
Well, this period of the fur trade, it lasted in eastern Canada till after the War of 1812. And after the War of 1812, there was an assimilationist policy brought in that eventually gave rise to the Indian Act. The first Indian Act was actually entitled An Act for the Gradual Civilization of the Indian Tribes in Canada. It seems that later in the 1800s, Darwinian ideas started to come into play much more, and there was this idea of kind of racial hierarchy. So the Indian Act system represents a violation of the basic principles of the Royal Proclamation, the basic principles of making treaty. Of course, you make treaties are classically embodiments of international law and illustrate the presence of international law. And treaties are voluntary, they're reciprocal. People come together, often with the pipe. You wouldn't lie, you wouldn't speak lightly in the presence of the pipe. So treaties are very important to Indigenous peoples in Canada. The larger society, however, seems not to relate to that or hasn't had an opportunity to learn about these treaties. To my way of thinking, we have a chance to make Canada a decent place, a good place for our children, for our descendants, if we can make something of this heritage. Of course, the period where there was a kind of partnership through the fur trade and through military alliance with Indigenous peoples in the East. In the West, it was the building of the CPR. So once the CPR was coming in, the CPR kind of displaced the Hudson's Bay Company, and the CPR required private landholding and urbanization and industrialization. So this recent 100 years, 150 years
Talking about
of the Indian Act.
Dominion?
What about the Dominion?
Well, Sir John A. South Canada's founding.
Well, I'm talking about the era after the CPR. was an era of reserves, was an era of the Indian Act. Ottawa would govern Indian people, would treat them as wards of the state. To be a ward of the state, of the federal state, meant that people couldn't vote, people couldn't make contracts, people couldn't run for office, hold office. It's very crippling. Interestingly,
Or hire a lawyer.
or go to court. So just in the era when corporations were becoming natural persons and acquiring the capacity to sue, be sued, hire people, go to court, it was precisely that era that Indigenous peoples were being made into non-persons, not citizens, not having the right of self-determination. So what's going on in the courts, you have to see it in the context that it's really only in the recent generation that this has been accessible to Indigenous people to bring their issues into court. But the major era of their disempowerment, dispossession, they had no recourse. There was no venue to go and seek redress for all of the larceny that took place, the kleptocracy. I mean, let's face it, we look around Canada, the United States, and we see that Indigenous peoples are marginalized and kind of treated often as the strangers in their own place, and it's incumbent upon them to learn the laws and the culture and the languages of the colonizing society, where the colonizing society doesn't feel much imperative or need to learn the identities and about the Indigenous people. So that's obviously wrong. So
When and how was that right to be represented in court restored? How did that come about, and when did it come about?
it was largely in the era of John Diefenbaker, who was committed to something called a Bill of Rights. It was, mere legislation. He wasn't at the point of being able to constitutionalize this. I think he was starting to look, as many in the Commonwealth were looking at South Africa and seeing the disenfranchisement of the Indigenous people in South Africa wasn't viable, wasn't supportable, wasn't decent, wasn't according to human rights. And so look in your own backyard. Indigenous people didn't have the vote. Some Indigenous peoples in Canada protested. They said, no, we don't want to take the vote. We're treaty people. Our relationship with the Crown is, we're not just an interest group among other interest groups. We have a very distinct relationship, and that came out in response to Pierre Trudeau's white paper in 1969, where he said, okay, you're citizens now, you have the vote, let's do away with the Indian Act, let's do away with reserves, let's privatize and municipalize reserves, let's do away with treaties, and we're all equal, we all have the same chance to make it or break it. And people said no. Harold Cardinal and the Alberta Indian Association was leading the way and saying, no, we have treaties, we have special relations. So I found myself over the years getting particularly interested in a period from 1754 to 1814, where these issues of what about the Indigenous peoples? What about their relationship to land, their land rights? If we are going to take their lands, who's going to be empowered to take those lands? Will it be private individuals just going and cutting deals with individual Indian groups? Or will there be a systematic way to do it, an orderly way to do it? Will these new polities in North America, will there be a place for Indigenous peoples? Will they simply be eliminated in the idea that this is progress, this is savagery giving way to civilization, this old paradigm, which I see being repeated now in the language of the war on terror, justifying new forms of imperialism, new forms of dispossession of Indigenous peoples. These old ideas that, well, we're not going for their resources, we're going to bring them education and democracy and knowledge of capitalism and free enterprise, and so we're really going to clear away the darkness and bring in the light of our, this is very old. This goes back to, the Columbian conquest in 1492. But this particular period from 1754 to 1814, these issues really came up for a reckoning, for consideration. And as I view it, the United States emerged in the idea that well, we're not going to be held back by any regard for the human rights of Indigenous peoples. Either we eliminate them or they join us and become like us and become part of us. And of course, that western expansion of the United States, it continued. Once they got to the Pacific, they continued and took over Hawaii, preempted the Indigenous people in Hawaii. They went across to the Philippines and took over the colonizing project from the Spanish. The Monroe Doctrine, they said, well, the government of South America and Central America, no imperial government from Europe can take part. So this emergence of the United States from a denial of the imperative of the Royal Proclamation, continues to characterize how the world is structured. King George, with his prohibition on empire building through conquest, his insistence, and really it was his advisor, Sir William Johnson, in what we now call Upper New York State, who worked closely and was part of the Haudenosaunee, the Longhouse League, and learned the protocols of the Longhouse League and the Covenant Chain. He advised King George in the wording that came out in the Royal Proclamation. So we start the period with these two colonizing powers, the Roman Catholic French Empire, the Protestant British Empire, in conflict. Who is going to control the Ohio Valley? The French strategy is if we could connect the St. Lawrence, the Empire of the St. Lawrence, with the Empire of the Mississippi through the Ohio Valley area, we'd have the Anglos boxed in, and we could dominate in North America. So it sort of came down to this contest: who could make alliances with the Indigenous peoples in the Ohio Valley. And so the British, learned from the French Indian diplomacy, and the Royal Proclamation was an outgrowth of that. So British North America then incorporates Canada, incorporates the French-speaking Roman Catholics, it incorporates the Indigenous peoples, and in a somewhat sporadic, haphazard way, the principles of the Royal Proclamation were applied sufficiently to inflame Anglo-American resistance. So the Anglo-American resistance in what I would call a civil war within British North America, that we remember as the American Revolution, this had a lot to do with the unwillingness of some in Anglo-America and some backers in Europe, the unwillingness to go along with some kind of effort to incorporate Indigenous peoples into the new polities of North America. And of course this created a very unstable situation. The British had actually promised in the first treaty, negotiated according to the terms of the Royal Proclamation, a treaty at Fort Stanwix, where Sir William Johnson played a major role. That treaty confirmed all the lands north of the Ohio River as being lands reserved to the Indians as their hunting ground. And in 1783, in the Treaty of Paris, some European diplomats, British diplomats, agreed to hand over the lands north of the Ohio River to the United States of America. And that was appalling to the military people on the ground in Upper Canada. And so it led to a kind of instability. The British actually retained their posts south of the Great Lakes for a time with their Indian allies, with their fur trading partners. And eventually this gave rise to the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 really has it's a very significant contest, military contest, that has at its foundations, at its philosophic or ideological foundations, this question about the role of Indian people in the future of North America. From the perspective of the U.S. Army, which were largely Indian fighters from Tennessee and Kentucky, the British were sort of harboring Indian allies and arming them and giving them comfort and solace and trade relations. So the War of 1812 from the U.S. perspective was to clear out this British base, to support the Indians who were in their way of Western expansion. And on the Indian side, there was a view, well, we can, we have the balance of power here. We have an influential position. We can persuade the British to back us in the creation of a Indian polity with permanent borders. I mean, you think that Indian people's lands, it's always being pushed back and pushed back. It never goes the other way. It only goes one way. So the idea that Indian people would have a polity where they could make a stand, Tecumseh became a great spokesperson for this and a visionary of this, and traveled throughout North America saying, look, we've got to put aside our jealousies, our ethnic differences, our animosities and antagonisms. Yes, we're Potawatomi and Kickapoo and Miami and Odawa and Anishinaabeg and Shawnee, but we're all Indians, and our new polity, Indiana, should be based on a confederacy of Indian nations. We need to sort of follow the example of the United States and confederate among ourselves. And in that context, the British will back us to create north of the Ohio River a permanent polity within the British Empire, say an Aboriginal dominion. So this idea of Tecumseh, it didn't come to fruition, but as the Indian Confederacy was trying to advance that political agenda, Canada was defended. British North America was defended. In fact, the British Army, at the height of the Napoleonic Wars, was tied down in Europe, and Upper Canada, the backwoods of Upper Canada, there wasn't a British military presence. So 12,000 Indian soldiers in the Confederacy, the Indian Confederacy of Canada, Tecumseh's Indian Confederacy. And he was, in my view, the most visionary, forward-looking leader that Indian country has seen. He really is a founder of Canada. I think he's as important as John A. Macdonald, say, in the founding of Canada. So in the War of 1812, the Indian Confederacy defended Canada from annexation by the United States. If it wasn't for the role played by the Indian Confederacy, we'd now be under the stars and stripes here in Canada. And to me, that's a very significant idea, that Canada, and it's not only an idea, it's a reality rooted in history. If it wasn't for Indigenous peoples, Canada would be annexed by the United States. So not only can it be said in Canada that Indigenous people have never been conquered, the reality in Canada is that Indigenous people have defended Canada from conquest, by what would become the most aggressive military polity ever known, the United States of America.